Hey, everybody. In this lecture, we're going to talk about the creation of the church in Denham. And when I say the creation of the church, I'm not talking about the physical structure, the building itself in which religious services were held. Going back to our discussion of the Protestant Reformation, I told you that many Protestant denominations breaking away from the Catholic Church de-emphasized the physical structure of the church itself, trying to get away from the grandeur of Catholic cathedrals with their gold and stained glass and marble that churches for a lot of Protestant denominations, not all of them, but a lot of them, became more simple buildings. For the Puritans and other like-minded Christians, the church is not a physical structure, but rather the collection of believers. The church is the people that come together to share their religious experience. And so in the chapter you've read on the creation of the church, if you've read it already, and in my discussion here, we're not talking about guys pulling out hammers and cutting wood and making a building. We're going to be talking about the covenant for the creation of the church, the rules they were going to have about what the nature of their church was going to be like. Now, don't get confused. We've already talked about one covenant already. We talked about the covenant for the creation of the town, which I told you to think of sort of like a constitution for the town. The Puritans in Denham, just like other Puritan towns in the surrounding areas, also had a covenant for the creation of their church. These would be the rules for their church. Right? So that's what we're mostly going to be talking about in this lecture. So let's get going. When I first read Lockridge's book, the most surprising thing I learned in the book had to do with this very topic we're dealing with right now. My preconceived notions about church creation for the Puritans were that I would have imagined before reading the book that if you told me a group of Puritans were creating a new town, I would have imagined the very first thing they would have done would have been to build a church, right? Maybe even before they built homes for shelter, maybe even before they started planting crops in fields, that the very first thing they would have done is, start chopping down trees and building a church. Nothing could have been further from the truth, though. It was almost the exact opposite of that. Remember, the people that were going to create the town of Denham arrived in Boston in 1635. And in 1636, they took possession of their land granted by the General Court, this area of Denham that we've been talking about. It wasn't until a year later, in 1637, that they started to create their church. It took them a year. Now, was that because of apathy? Was that because they didn't care about the church that much? No, not at all. Just the opposite. My preconceived notions about church building in the Puritans was all wrong. Look at it from this perspective. Back in Europe, there had been the Catholic Church, which from the Puritan perspective had started to veer quite severely in the wrong direction as a church. And then, as Protestants were breaking away from the Catholic Church and creating their own churches, they were trying to get things back on track, getting back to some sort of notion of a pure church. The Church of England that they had come from never really got onto the right track in the first place. It was better than the Catholic Church. And just for the record, the Puritans still considered themselves to be within the Church of England. They were still trying to purify that church. We'll talk about this more later on, but their hope was by building pure churches in New England that the Church of England, back in England, would recognize the superiority of the Puritan churches and reform. But they technically still considered themselves to be within the Church of England. But the Church of England, while better than the Catholic Church, as we talked about before, the Puritans thought of as a compromise, that the Church of England had not broken sufficiently hard enough from some of the older vestiges of the Catholic Church. And the way the Puritans thought about it was that they were going to take their time in creating their church in England, or in Denham. They didn't want to get it wrong. They saw what happens when you start to get it wrong. That's what happened to the Catholic Church. That's what didn't happen with the Church of England. And so my expectation that the first thing they'd do is start chopping down trees and holding a church was very much misunderstood the priorities of the Puritans. The priority of the Puritans was not to build the quickest church, but rather to build an enduring church, to get the foundations and the fundamentals of the church solid so that the church would last decades, centuries, eternal. Right? And so it's revealing, actually, how long it took them to create their church. Now, the reason it took them over a year is because it took them a year of consideration and debate before they felt like they were ready to create that church. So let's talk about the actual process now. So in 1637, they started holding meetings on Friday nights at different people's houses in Denham to discuss the nature of the church. They were essentially working on the covenant for the church. And they started this by asking questions about what their church was going to be. And again, one of the things that blows my mind about this was their first question. They would ask a series of 13 questions, and Lockridge talks about some of them, not all of them, in your chapter, at these Friday meetings to come up with a covenant for the church. The first one blows my mind, which is they ask themselves, do we even have the right to create a church? That's how serious they were about this endeavor. They were so serious about it, they didn't want to take anything for granted. They wanted to begin at the most fundamental point where you could begin, which is, do we even have the right to create a church? Now, was there a possibility that they could come up with the answer no and say, no, we can't have a church? They weren't really debating, could they have the church? What they were really asking themselves is, can we, the people of Denham, independently on our own, create a church? Or do we need to get permission or coordinate this with some outside institution? Do we need to somehow get permission from somebody else to build this church? For example, this is how the Catholic Church does it. A group of Catholics can't just create a town and decide on their own, hey, we're going to create a church here. No. Within the Catholic Church, there is a whole hierarchy of institutions that need to approve the creation of a church. You can't just get a collection of Catholics to go out and build a church. It needs to be improved through the hierarchy of the Catholic Church. This is what the Puritans were really asking, and so as a practical matter, they might have been asking themselves, do we maybe need to go back to Boston and some of those earlier established churches? Remember, the Puritans first started arriving in Boston in 1630. And so there would have been older, not much older, but certainly older established churches, Puritan churches in Boston, and also some of the other surrounding towns. Might they need some sort of permission or coordination with those churches to create their own church? And they talked about this at these Friday night meetings and debated it and prayed about it and scoured the Bible to look for answers for this. And they came to the conclusion, no, we do not need permission from anybody else. Yes, we can create our own church. Now, before I move on to another question they asked themselves, it might be a good time to talk about that for the Puritans, this idea of creating a church was kind of problematic in that, from the Puritan perspective, when you looked at the Bible, there is no one unified section of the Bible that deals with this issue of creating a church. There is no particular part of the Bible that lays out a blueprint of creating a church. First you do this, then you do this, and then membership is guarded by this. There are fragments. There are pieces scattered throughout the Bible in the Old Testament and the New Testament discussing aspects of the nature of church. But it was a problematic thing that the Puritans believed. You really needed to get into the Bible and scour the Bible to look for answers. And this gets back to something we already discussed about the importance of the Bible. The Bible, from the Puritan perspective, was the revealed Word of God. That's what God wanted humans to know. It was in the Bible. Although, again, another issue maybe worth thinking about for some, particularly for my Christian students, is, just because you're a Christian, don't assume that you and the Puritans believe or agree on all the issues. There can be varying interpretations of these things. For example, the Bible was extremely important for the Puritans, but the Puritans did not believe in the literal interpretation of the Bible. That wasn't a thing at this time. That was a concept that derives later. The Bible needed to be interpreted in ways that made it quite difficult and not straightforward. And so that's why they were gathering everybody together on Friday nights to scour through the Bible for answers, to discuss, to debate, very importantly, to pray about this matter. So the first question they had was, can we create a church? And their answer was yes. They came with that. Yeah, that's what this frame is about. Now, the biggest debate that developed, the most difficult question to resolve at these meetings, had to do with church membership. And now we got to be really clear about something, because it will be easy to be confused, easy to get confused. Today, when we talk about church membership for most churches, we use the concept of membership and attendance interchangeably. They mean the same thing, So I attend that church regularly, therefore I am a member of that church. That was not the case with the Puritans. Attendance and membership were not the same thing. Let's be clear. First of all, every Puritan in the town of Denham was required to attend church. Everybody had to go to church. But not everybody was going to become a member of the church. This is one of the things they debated. Everybody had to go. You had to attend. But that didn't necessarily mean you were going to be a member of the church. So this was the trickiest of questions that they had to debate. All right. One possible answer was, remember, when we talked about the covenant for the town itself, the only people that were supposed to be living in this town were Christians. Remember, the first clause of the covenant is for the town covenant, the only people that can live here are Christians. The second clause in the covenant is, if you are not a Christian, you got to go somewhere else. All right. When they debated this question of who gets to be a member of the church, one of the options could have been, well, if you made it into this town, if you were allowed to live here among us, you are a like-minded Christian, therefore you get to be a member of the church, 100% membership. They decided against this. They rejected this option. And they did so because they were concerned about the purity of the church. What if we made a mistake? What if we let the wrong person move into town? What if we allowed the wrong people to move in the town? Are we also going to let them infect our church? Maybe lead our church astray? No. We need extra criteria. We need another layer of protection to help purify the church. And so what they decided as they debated this question was that the only people that were going to be allowed to be members of the church would be visible saints. Remember, in our previous lecture we talked about visible saints were people who other members of the community believed had gone through the stages of conversion and were one of the elect that were going to be going to heaven. All right? So unless you were believed to have gone through these stages of conversion, you were not going to be allowed to be a member of the church. You still had to attend church. You still had to go to services. But membership was another thing. Now, let's talk about, okay, so they're not the same thing, so what does that mean? Members of the church were granted certain rights and responsibilities in terms of the church. For example, one of the responsibilities of church members were you needed to contribute to the church. You needed to make offerings to the church. Strictly speaking, if you weren't a member, you weren't obligated to do that. You still could. You could still give money to the church or goods or services. But you didn't have to. Members had to do that. You also received certain rights within the church. Members were allowed to vote on choosing ministers. Who was going to be the minister? Church members were also granted certain sacraments through the church, like baptism and communion. Only members were granted these. Now, when I talk about, you got communion or you got a baptism, remember, the Puritans believed in predestination. So you were already predestined to go to heaven and hell. So if you weren't granted communion or, baptism, it didn't mean you were going to go to hell, that this was an issue you had to sweat in terms of that. That had already been predestined. However, it was an act of communing with God that, if you were a faithful person, you would have liked to have participated. You would have liked to have been baptized. You would have liked to participate in communion. So people wanted to be members of the church. Right? But to do so, you had to be a visible saint. Let me see, quick. Yeah, I'll get to that. Okay, so now another one of their questions has been to answer, like, who's going to get to be a member? All right, the answer, only visible saints, only people believed to be going to heaven. Okay, that brings up another question. Okay, who's going to decide this? Who's going to determine who's a visible saint and who wasn't? Well, the Puritans in Denham went about this in probably the most practical way they could. At one of these meetings, they looked around at each other and asked themselves in the group, okay, who amongst us do we think are the most likely visible saints? Who do we think are the most obvious visible saints here? Initially, they came up with the number of, Lockridge tells you, they initially came up with 10, and the number dropped below 10 for a little while, and then a new person moved into town that was very obvious to everybody, was a visible saint, and the number jumped up again. The specific number is not important. It was a handful of people. And what the rest of them decided and voted on was that these will be the first members of the church. We think these visible saints are the most solid, and therefore it will then be their job to select other people to be members of the church. So they got the most likely visible saints and then put those people in charge of selecting membership. And the way the process worked was, if you wanted to be a member of the church, you would go before this panel and talk about your conversion. This is one of the reasons why in a previous lecture I talked about the nature of conversion. You would have to tell these people, remember that second stage in which you felt like the Lord was working in your life and preparing you? You'd have to be able to describe that to the panel. And then that third stage, that precise moment in which your sins were forgiven, you would need to be able to talk about that. And if you were a visible saint, you should have been able to describe that. And then other people could be brought in to talk about that fourth stage, where after your sins were forgiven, you are now living a better life and being a better person. Your spouse could be brought in, talk about how you are a better spouse. Your children or parents could be brought in. Neighbors could be brought in to talk about the change in your life. And if this panel of visible saints believed your tale of conversion, you would be granted membership into the church. That's the way the process worked. Now, after everybody that applied had their stories heard, turns out 80% of the members of the town were granted church membership, leaving 20% that were not members of the church. That other 20%, again, I keep hitting this because it can be a little confusing. That other 20% still had to go to church. They still had to attend. But they weren't members of the church. So most, 80% were members, 20% were not. Okay. It's important to point out that of that 20%, most of those people weren't actually rejected. Most of that 20% didn't apply for membership. Why would you not apply for membership? Wouldn't everybody love to be a member of the church? Yeah, sure, they would. But remember I told you that those stages of conversion happen to people at different stages of their life, some young, some middling, some literally on their deathbeds. Not everybody in Denham felt like they had gone through those stages of conversion. Not all of them felt like it had happened to them yet. And if you honestly believed that you had not gone through those stages of conversion, you wouldn't bother applying for membership, because the only way to get to be a member was to go through those stages or to try and lie your way through that. And most faithful Puritans wouldn't want to lie about something as serious about this. That's not to say they didn't, but some of them would have felt like. Most would not want to lie about this thing. What does that say about you if you're willing to lie about this thing? So rather, of that 20%, most never applied and waited patiently, hopefully, for that time in which God, who was all powerful and predetermined everything, would have appointed for you that conversion. You would have waited. This is also why Lockridge tells us there wasn't much in the way of resentment in town against people who weren't members of the church or who weren't visible saints. Because everybody, all of these Puritans, would have known of examples of people, either family or friends in their lives, who didn't receive conversion until very old. And so, you're 27 years old and you don't feel like you've received God's forgiveness and gone through this conversion. It doesn't mean it's never going to happen to you. In fact, your friends and family, if you were a genuinely good and faithful person, would often encourage you and tell you, hey, it hasn't happened to you yet, but I'm sure it's going to happen at some point in the future. So you're not a visible saint now, but I think it's going to happen. And so with church membership, okay, you're not a member now, but hopefully at some point you go through those stages of conversion and then you can apply for church membership. So most of that 20% weren't disgruntled individuals that were mad about their lack of membership. Most would have realized why they weren't members of the church and sort of would have accepted that. Now, they answer all their other questions, and later in 1637, they create their church. Lockridge tells you that this decision about church membership was a fateful one. And we're going to talk about it more as time goes on, because we see two competing impulses in contradiction with one another with the Puritans here. On the one hand, we talked a little about it, we'll talk more about it as we go. The Puritans were communal. They thought of group, and they liked cohesion. Remember, we talked about the corporate nature, the closed nature of their society. And so they really didn't like a community that possessed some people that were in, church members, and some people that were out, non-church members. It was kind of problematic in theory. Now, that desire for cohesion of the community and everybody being in went up against another priority for the Puritans, and that we've already discussed here, and that was the purity of the church. They were so worried about the purity of the church. They knew what happened when things go wrong in churches. The Catholic Church went wrong. The Church of England never really, it was better than the Church of the Catholic Church, but it never really got onto solid footing. It never really had a solid foundation. And now we have this opportunity to create a church, and we got to be really careful. And so we're going to add another layer of security. Some people are going to be in, and then some people are going to be out. Now, one of the things that made this tension between societal cohesion and differing membership in the church was the idea that as time went on, that 80% would increase. That as the town grew, as the town pleased God, doing their best in that utopian vision to live up to God's plan for them, that number would go up. eventually 85%, eventually 90, 95%, maybe not 100%, because, there's always problems with the Puritans. Remember, man is evil. That's a problem you just can't get away around. So maybe you'll never get to 100%, but maybe very close. As we're going to talk about, it never happened. In fact, as we will talk about, church membership is going to decline. Right? It's going to decline. Okay. But in the beginning, people were pretty satisfied with this. Right? Like I told you, most of the people that were not members understood why they weren't members. And also, membership seemed to be, Lockridge tells us, quite fair in terms of demographics and wealth and things like that. A roughly equivalent proportion of women were admitted to the church as men. So that seemed fair. No reason for either men or women to complain about church membership. Wealth didn't seem to play a factor in church membership. We might speculate that richer people were granted membership in higher proportion to poorer people. A lot of times, wealth brings you advantage in society. Lockridge tells us no, that didn't seem to happen either. That there were examples, he tells us, of servants working in the homes of wealthier people in Denham, where the servant was a member of the church and the master in the home was not. So in the beginning, it wasn't a problem with this 80% membership. And they were hopeful that number would increase. But as I told you before, 80% would actually wind up being the high water mark. It would never get above that. And in fact, membership was going to decline. Maybe on that cliffhanger, I'll leave it there. All right. And so that's it for the church. Everybody take care. I'll see you next time.